3-to-1 action.
Thank you. It's now on air. All right, so let's hope that this recording works better than last time. Although I do have a friend of mine who's been collaborating with me on other projects is going to work with me to try and recapture what we discussed last week. Because as I've talked before, I hate just talking to the camera. So he's going to be my foil so that we can work out at least a condensed version of last week's, because I do think it was an important topic that needs to get a broader audience. Okay. And this week we're going to be looking at everybody's favorite parasha of Terumah, right? Because we've been having the most amazing narrative, right? Beginning with creation, we've been just marching through the generations and the explosion of belief and faith in God, and then the following of God through the whole Exodus story. And now we have gotten out of the sea and we received the 10 Commandments and we received all the laws of Mishpatim. We understand we are going to be a just, we are going to be a holy nation. And now, building code. Now it's, how do you make an ark? How many slats need to go into the wall for making the enclosure around the Mishkan? And what hides should we use for those curtains and coverings? You're yawning already, exactly. Slumping down in the chair. Well, if you're volunteering to read, you're going to be stuck with it. So you better not fall asleep. You got to read this dramatically, Ariane. Right? If you get to read Mishpatim, you get to read this. And that's really how it often feels. As many people will see this as kind of, all right, we've reached this point in winter where there's nothing left in the narrative except for a few more little episodes. Got the whole golden calf thing coming up, and that's kind of important. But between here and Bamidbar, between here and when we actually leave Mount Sinai, it's this and Leviticus. And a lot of people's eyes just sort of roll into their head. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the central piece of this whole construction is totally misunderstood of what was going on. So what are the pieces of this construction? What are we building in this week's parasha? Just shout them out, people. It's okay.
A Mishkan.
Okay, so we're building a Mishkan, right? And the Mishkan is the actual sort of tent that will have other components within it, right? And that would be what components go into it? What's that?
Menorah.
All right, so we have the menorah, we have the shulchan, right, which is the table.
But the tablets.
Just a second, we've got
tablets go?
well, we've got tablets, but those aren't being built now. Those were pre-assembled.
Yes, but don't they go in there?
But they go in someplace very particular,
okay.
right? So they go into the ark, right? Which is, famous Raiders of the Lost Ark type scene ark. We have the, I'm just going to stick with English because I don't want to write double. We have the curtain, the parochet that separates one part of the Mishkan from the other. We have the, we're going to call it the golden altar, which is where the incense was burnt. Right, and on the shulchan, we also had, the what do they call that in English? Lechem panim, showbread. Showbread, yeah. Shewbread, yeah, I know. It's one of those words that it's probably just better to leave it in Hebrew. Lechem panim, because no one knows what showbread or shewbread is anyway, except for apparently King James. So we've got all of these things, and most of these people are at least moderately familiar with, right? We know what a menorah is. We definitely know what the ark is, although many people have Steven Spielberg to thank for that. We have an idea of a curtain, of a parochet, because many arks in many congregations still have a curtain, so there's some similarity there. The incense, people are kind of sort of familiar with that. Again, more thanks to outside influences, mainly through Christians or even Buddhists who also burn incense. So people sort of know what that looks like. And a table, okay, fine. You can sort of imagine what a table is. Outside the Mishkan itself, outside the tent structure itself, what else are we building?
Well, there's the stone altar, the sacrificial altar.
There is the altar outside, or it's called the Mizbeach Olah, or Mizbach Olah, the altar for the sacrifices, as opposed to the altar for the incense, which is inside the tent. What does that look like? Anyone want to draw a picture? No? Well, wait. You could draw me a picture of menorah, right?
Yes.
You could, and we'd argue about the exact definition of the cherubim, the angels on top. But you could draw me a picture of the Ark of the Covenant. Curtain, no problem. Might have a little trouble with the golden altar as well. But what's this altar look like?
It's like
What?
a barbecue pit.
It's like a barbecue pit. Well, what happens on it? What's it made out of?
Stone,
What?
stones.
Is it-
cut.
How much you want to bet?
That's what it said.
It's what it said in the section you read during Parashat Yitro. It talked about building the altar out of stone. We're going to get a different description of the altar in Parashat Terumah, which we have to reconcile. What was its function? Why did we have a mizbeach? What's that? Why are we shy about that word? Sacrifices? It was for the sacrifices, right? The altar that stood outside was where the sacrifices were either consumed to ash, or parts of them were turned into smoke, or upon which the blood was sprinkled from sacrifices. And maybe by everyone's look of little slight discomfort, that's why we don't talk about this so much. And yet, without understanding how this fit in and how all of the other parts of the Mishkan fit in, it's understandable why these chapters are a little dull and why the details may seem totally superfluous. Because after all, if I don't really care about what happens on the altar, if I don't really care about what it symbolizes, why should I care what it looks like? Right? Just tell me there was an altar, and then let's move on with the story. Right? Tell me there was an ark, and then move on with the story. I don't need, unless I'm Steven Spielberg, to know exactly what it looked like, because I'm not trying to visualize it. I'm just trying to move on. We're going to try and visualize. We're going to focus on the altar because it's the part that most people are least familiar with. But we're going to try and see if we can figure out what it is. So let's start from the Torah's on instructions. Chapter 27, page 496.
You shall make the altar of acacia wood, 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. The altar is to be square and 3 cubits high.
Okay, so how big is this thing? What's a cubit?
What's a cubit?
Right, what's an amah?
Like a yard.
Not a yard. That's a little too much. It's exactly. So the technical definition of an amah is from the tip of your middle finger to your elbow, right? Which is different on all of us. So we roughly estimated it being about 18 inches because it makes the math easy. So just multiply the number by 1.5. So how big is this thing?
7.5 by 7.5 by 4.5.
7.5 feet by 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet.
4.5.
Well, high, yes, exactly. So imagine this table, a little higher and not quite as long, square.
7.5 feet high?
7.5 feet across and 7.5 feet deep.
That's right, it's not that high.
What's that?
Right.
Is this a 6-foot table?
Right.
Yeah.
Hold on a second. That may be a warning that we've lost the signal again.
Oh,
Let me just double check. We're still okay? I think we might still be okay. Hold on. I'm just paranoid now.
yeah.
No, it's still going. Okay. Yay.
No, this is a 6 foot.
Okay.
Okay, the table.
All right. So this is a 6-foot table.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
It's about 6 foot. Okay, so a little bit bigger than this table, right? So if we took, this table and the same amount out, that's how big this was.
Okay.
All right. Does that fit your picture? Did you think of the altar and being that big before? Or did you think of it as being bigger? Thought of it being bigger? Thought of it being smaller? Exactly right. Now, part of the reason why there was such confusion about the size of the altar is, what are we going to do with this thing? Every time we take down the Mishkan, what has to happen?
Yeah.
They carry it.
We're going to carry this.
Whoa.
And 7 feet made of stone,
Right.
little rough. And that's why it's made of acacia wood. The altar itself was made of wood,
Right.
but it's made of wood, but we're going to be burning stuff on it?
Yeah.
I see a problem here.
Oh, yes.
right? That's why most of us think of it as being stone, because we know that there was fire involved. And so wood and fire usually don't work together so well, not in a long-term way. And so most of us visualize it as being stone. The other part that makes the sign so hard to remember is the altar that is described in Solomon's temple, and then later in the second temple, is much, much larger. And so this visualization both seems too small because we know that the one in the temple later on in Jerusalem will be much bigger, and this seems too big because we know we're going to be carrying it. And we often confuse it with that little golden altar, which is much smaller, where the incense was burnt inside the Mishkan. So we get trouble. Let's see if we can get that straightened out. 7 foot, 7 foot, and about 4.5 feet high. So about like that. Okay? And the stones, by the way, were used to make the ramp that went up to the altar. That's where the stones were involved. Okay.
And this was the portable altar. This is the one we're going to take around.
Yeah, this is the portable one. Yeah, we're not leaving it behind. And the stones also were used for during the intermediate time period where people could build altars of their own. Stones were required. All right, that was one sentence.
Make its horns on the 4 corners, the horns to be of one piece with it, and overlay it with copper.
Okay, so 2 very important bits of information here. 1, fireproofing, right? It's being covered in copper or bronze. Some debate about exactly which alloy is being used, but they're essentially very, very similar. So you're covering the whole wood in a bronze sheet that will be hammered into place to make the entire thing secure and fireproof. And it also gets horns. Horns? We're putting horns on the altar?
Is it a bad translation?
It is not a bad translation. It is a perfectly fine translation. And if we were ancient Semites, we would know exactly what that meant. Because if you go digging around the ancient Near East, you will find altars with horns everywhere throughout the ancient Near East. It is a very, very common altar design. And we're doing okay? I think we're okay. I'll just leave that out there. Okay, so let me explain to you what the horns mean. Now, when you look in you look at medieval Christian texts or other scholarly works that were trying to draw pictures of this, they were baffled by the horns as well. Because who had horns on their altar? You know, the horns they thought of were like bull horns or something. And so the drawings are quite comical. But when you do archaeology and you dig up ancient examples of other horned altars from the area, you begin to get an idea of what it must have looked like. So if you dig around the ancient Near East, you will find, I'm going to test my skills here, altars that look like this. They have little triangular protrusions at the corners that are poking up. And I'm going to give you a diagram when we get to the handout. And there's your horn. Done. Right? Each of the 4 corners would have had a little protrusion that poked up, a little corner piece that went up into a point at each of the 4 corners. So rather than having the top of your altar be perfectly smooth, there would be these little 4 points. And as we're going to see, there's also an interior part to the altar as well.
And the purpose of the horns?
Well, that's where you put the blood.
Oh, you sprinkle.
That's where you sprinkle the blood. Well, it's actually a very complicated, well, for some of the rituals. Where you put the blood depends on different rituals. Sometimes it's on the horn, sometimes it's on the side, sometimes it's above a line, it's below a line. It gets complicated, and that's what the book of Leviticus tells us a lot more about, as well as our sages of blessed memory. But the horns were used for some of the sacrifices for the sprinkling of the blood. We got an image now, right? Where we're approximately 7 feet like that, and back 7 feet as well, because it's a square, and approximately. All right, that's getting annoying now. Yeah. Either that means a whole bunch of people are coming and watching it, or it's just, let's turn that volume. Where's my volume button? There we are. Yay. Okay. So now we've got a visualization. Yes, maybe a little bit. 3rd sentence.
Make the pails for removing its ashes, as well as its scrapers, basins, flesh hooks, and fire pans. Make all its utensils of copper.
All right, so now we're going to get not just the altar, but for the altar to work, you've also got to have little like shovels and scrapers, and you have to have sort of hooky things. And I'm drawing it like that because we're not 100% sure what they look like. If you want somebody who thinks they know, you can talk to the Temple Institute in Jerusalem. They're making their own new versions. And you've got pails and other things for collecting ash and whatnot. Because the ash itself that collects inside the altar from the burning is not something you just throw out, right? That's not for your garden. That had to be disposed of properly. And all the implements that were used, you didn't just get your shop vac out at the end of each day and just go cleaning up the altar and chuck it out. Cleaning up this ash was a very important part of the ritual care of the entire service.
Is this? Oh, sorry. Are these people still out in the desert?
You mean during this part?
Yes.
Yes, we're at the very beginning of our desert stay.
Where are they supposed to get all of this copper and acacia wood?
Mhm.
I've been out there. It's sand, sky and sand.
Okay, so the acacia wood, there is a very famous midrash that the patriarchs knew that we would need acacia wood when we left. And so poured up in advance before the Exodus. If you don't like that story, if you don't like that explanation, right, Devar Acher, there's another explanation, which is despite the fact that the Sinai wilderness is not a very hospitable place, it does have some things that are there, that some local resources, and B, it is one of the main caravan routes between the northern area, what we call Israel, and the Saudi Arabian area where the other trades would come through, and Egypt, one of the largest empires in the world at the time. So trading with some of the caravans as they came and went across the desert would have been fine with the things that we had gotten when we left Egypt in the first place. So it's not impossible to imagine this. And we're not talking about a huge quantity of wood or of metals being used here. It's a lot, but it's not enormous. It's definitely doable.
And the shechting took place on the altar also, or off of the altar?
At the altar.
Yeah.
Don't you love
What a
preposition?
diplomat you
Don't you
are.
love prepositions? It means that, no, the animals were not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily lead the cow up onto the altar to kill the cow for the sacrifice, but the cow would be killed at the altar, the blood collected and the other parts that were needed for the sacrifice, depending upon which sacrifice you were doing. That would then be used at the altar right there. Okay, any more questions on the intermediate part so far? Onwards.
Make for it a grating of meshwork in copper, and on the mesh, make 4 copper rings at its 4 corners.
Go ahead and keep going a little bit more.
Set the mesh below, under the ledge of the altar, so that it extends to the middle of the altar, and make poles for the altar, poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with copper.
All right, we got this mesh and we got some rings so that we can put the poles
Right.
in to carry it.
Right, the poles should be inserted into the rings so that the poles remain on the 2 sides of the altar when it is carried. Make it hollow of boards, as you were shown on the mountain, so shall they be made.
All right, as you were shown on the mountain means, from this description alone, could you go out and recreate a mizbeach that would look identical to the one that was used in the wilderness?
Like monkeys on the typewriter?
Yeah. No.
We got a little bit more guidance than just the monkeys, but basically it's saying, look, God is giving us these descriptions to be written down, but the precise visualization of it, the blueprints, that was given to Moses. And Moses then explained it to Bezalel, the main craftsman of this time, and apparently would have also reviewed his work and said, yeah, that's what I saw, to make sure that they ended up with the right one. So this is an approximation. We don't know, exactly how steep these angles were. We know that this was approximately 18 inches up because it was 1 cubit up, but we don't know, maybe it did protrude a little bit outward more We don't know precisely, but we do have at least some of the general information about what the altar itself would have looked like. Okay? All right, so let's get down to some of our commentary on this. You okay? It's only a few verses. You're really sweating there.
Even though not made of stone, it's still with the copper and the wood has to be fairly heavy.
Yeah, 7 foot by 7 foot of copper would not have been light, which is why you definitely would want nice strong poles to haul this, and why it's not a one-man job.
Just a general confusion about this.
Go for it.
Why would God and the Torah spend so much time on this detail and totally leave out the whole judicial system in terms of the infrastructure, how the judges should be appointed, the roles of, the stuff that Yitro said, wouldn't it be a good idea if you did, like, that is like 1,000 times, to me, 1,000 times more important than this kind of detail.
So first of all, the specific issue that you gave of the allocation of judges and, to divide them among different groups of people was not an expressed mitzvah in the sense that it had to be like that only. So if another community would found that it had a different way of organizing the judges to be for different groups of people, they wouldn't be breaking Torah. That'd be fine. And so it couldn't give as much detail there without running the risk of then boxing us in to only that way, no matter what the other circumstances might be. So oftentimes where there's less detail, there is intentionally more room for flexibility. And so too here, there was only going to be this altar. And God was trying to make sure that any altar we built followed this template and this template only. One of the things that we've discussed last year, maybe the year before, was the idea that much of the sacrificial service was God accommodating us rather than us accommodating God. That is to say, God knew that we were thoroughly indoctrinated in the idea of a sacrificial system. And therefore, we were going to instinctually want to sacrifice. It's what the Egyptians did. It's what the Canaanites did. It's what everyone did. Like I said, you dig up these altars everywhere. And the idea might have been that if you're going to do it, you're going to do it precisely this way. And I'm going to give you no wiggle room whatsoever, no judicial discretion about the altar, the construction. Whereas for handling other cases, like what to do with lost property, what to do with boundary markers, what to do with cases of murder, I'm going to give you all that you need to then be able to apply it on a case-by-case basis. Because that you need to have more flexibility and adaptability, and that I want you to be thoroughly involved in the exploration of that law. This, I want you to do it and be done with it. And when you do it, I want you to learn something from it, but I don't want you to go on and on and on and just keep creating with this. I want you to keep creating the justice stuff, not recreating all of this. Just know it, because there are truths to be found, but its greater detail is actually more limiting than the other.
Right.
Okay, Harriet, from the top.
Okay. Now, you'll have to tell me what that Hebrew word is.
It's the word for altar,
So,
mizbeach.
okay. The Hebrew word mizbeach derived from the word zbeach, denoting the slaughter of an animal for sacrifice.
Right, so zvachim, slaughterings, it's the same root word in Hebrew. The altar itself is not called, I erased my word altar. The altar itself is not called altar in Hebrew. It's called slaughter place. It's giving you its function in its name. Right? Altar in English is a very fancy, highfalutin term that's, altar. And it's very fancy. Yes.
But it doesn't happen there. It happens near it.
Well, it doesn't happen on it, but the slaughter happens for it.
Ah, that's good.
Okay, so and its existence is for the slaughter. So one of the things by naming it Mizbeach that we know is that this item is not a standalone item. If we built the Mizbeach, we built the altar, and we just left it there in the courtyard, we have accomplished nothing. Not so the Ark of the Covenant. right? The Ark of the Covenant, we can build and stick the Ten Commandments and other things into it, and we leave it in the Holy of Holies, and we have done absolutely what we're supposed to do. This is nothing until we start getting the smoke coming out of it, and until we've got Senor Cow, that's a cow, over here being slaughtered for the sacrificial service. This is all a package, which is why it goes into the details of all the shovels and the hooks and the pails that are needed for its use. Because this is not a decorative item. This is a functional item. And again, in many other English usages of the word altar, altar is a decorative term. It's something that's big and fancy and impressive, and it sits there and wow, it's an altar. Not in Judaism. This is a functional item, and we've got to explore its function then. Make sense? Maybe? Onward.
The copper altar located in the courtyard in front of the tabernacle.
Okay, so Rashbam wanted to make sure that we understood which altar we were talking about, because there is a different altar, which was the gold altar that we mentioned before. And the gold altar had already been mentioned earlier in Parashat Terumah. So he's trying to keep us from being confused, right? As Wikipedia would say, disambiguation, right? So you got the gold altar and you got the copper altar. This is the copper one, or bronze as you choose.
The horns were a feature of all altars, as were the shovels and the basins for the blood as receptacles.
Right, the basins, the pails, you can pick your translation there. So Sforno is trying to point out that these horns, not unique to this altar. Right? That was the style of altars. Sforno had a slightly better sources during his day and age than many other scholars. And so he recognized that when God told us to put horns on it, he wasn't making a novel instruction, that this was following the style. And that shouldn't surprise us too much. If you go to most synagogues around the world, the synagogue architecture, while uniquely Jewish, will also follow in many other ways the style of the culture that it's, right? If you go to the North Africa, you will find a heavy North African influence on Jewish architecture. If you go to England, you will find heavy British architectural influence, and so on across the world. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone? Yes? Good.
Okay. Shovels to catch the blood, which is to be sprinkled on the altar. The forks to handle parts of the limbs of sacrificial animals on the altar, and to turn so that would burn up within the time limit assigned for this.
Right?
Barbecue tools.
Barbecue tools, exactly. Right? When you buy your barbecue, you better buy some tongs. Because if you don't buy tongs, what are you going to do? You got to get one of those brushes for scraping the grill down. Or at least that's what I've been told.
You need a rotisserie.
You need a rotisserie? Well, we didn't actually do rotisserie sacrifices, but again, this is underscoring the notion that the Mizbeach was a functional item. And its function included all of these other pieces, because without these other pieces, it couldn't do its job, right? You can't turn to fire something on the altar unless you can actually turn it around. And that means the thing that's turning it around is an essential ingredient to the altar itself. It's not just, oh, you might also want to pick up one of these. It's, no, if you're going to do it, you got to have this, because you're doing it. You're not just owning it.
Okay, so some of the sacrifices, you were supposed to burn it up to ash and smoke, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, all the sacrifices, all the sacrifices had some elements which were completely consumed, thank you, in smoke and fire. And then many sacrifices had portions that were consumed in fire, but portions that were not and would be eaten. And then other sacrifices were 100% consumed. So everything was going to be putting at least a little bit, at least if it was the fat or the blood, would be going on the altar. And then whether or not the rest of the animal went on the altar depended upon the sacrifice. And that's the book of Leviticus is all about. Well, not all about. It's got a lot of other good stuff too.
Now, these people had just come from slavery, but all around them, they know how sacrifices had to be and what it looked like and all. And this is God, I think, being so specific that there are not going to be any idols around. There's no little statues. This is so specific as to what's there that you wouldn't add some of the other things that you would know religion wants, because he's changing the religion in a way that wouldn't necessarily make sense
Right. So
at that
notice,
time.
we're not carving a little picture of Moses on the altar, right? We're not doing a fresco of angels on the altar. The only things that we made that were of angelic form were when we were ordered to make the angelic form. And again, coming back again to Howie's question of why is there so much detail here? It's exactly as Harriet is saying, because we know what sacrifice is like when we are most likely to get it wrong, right? Anybody who thinks they know about a subject, they think they're an expert, they think they've got it all down, that's when you're most likely to make a mistake. And because everybody knows how sacrifices are done, is why God has to give such painstaking detail, at least it feels painful to us now, exactly how it's going to be done to make sure that these people who would have been thoroughly steeped in the Egyptian system and then the Canaanite system wouldn't just do it like everyone else. They would be very, very careful to avoid doing it in those other ways. Make sense? Okay, onward.
Okay.
Now we're going to get into, so what does it mean, right? Okay, very functional, very nice. I'm not going to sacrifice anything. I mean, there's a chance in my lifetime, perhaps the temple will be reestablished and Mashiach will come and maybe it will be clear that we are supposed to do sacrifices again. Whole nother discussion for another course. But right now, I have no anticipation that I will ever take an animal to the altar in Jerusalem. So why should I care what it looked like, how it was made, and what was done on it? Right? I mean, this is just history. Yes? Yeah, well, it's just been history for about 2,000 years. And yet our ancestors have worked very carefully to try and teach us it's not just history. And these descriptions were not just blueprints. There is something else that's being taught here. So we're going to just dip our toe into it.
The staves of the ark. The staves of the ark were not removed so that they would forever be ready for fear we might need to move the ark quickly and they would not be checked properly.
And then the staves would snap or break or not be secure.
Another reason is that the form of every object must imply and connote sublime supernal themes, so that a man will be influenced for good through his contemplation of them. God wished for good that it should not lose that form even for a moment.
Okay, let's see if we can unpack this. This section from Sefer HaChinuch, which we've read from before, is talking about the Ark of the Covenant, but the issue that's being described here is the poles at the Ark, which were similar to the poles in the altar. The poles were never taken out. And the author wants to know, our sages wanted to know, why would you never take the poles out? I mean, the poles aren't part of the Ark. The poles are just there for carrying it. So if I'm not carrying it, why should I leave the poles in?
Because you never know.
So the first answer is you never know, right? God forbid the camp is being attacked and you need to get the ark up and get to it. So if those staves aren't in there, you may just grab a pole, slide it in the hooks and go to lift, and maybe it won't be set right, or maybe the staff you grab will be weak and it's not good, and you're going to go to pick it up and it's going to go crack and the whole thing's going to crash down. So first example is one I think we can all relate to, practical. Right? You never know. And this is too important to risk on the fly. But what's the second explanation here?
That gazing at these things are going to produce a positive spiritual reaction in us. Maybe.
Yes, gazing I'll take in a little more metaphorical sense, contemplating, right? Because we can't actually see it. And Sefer HaChinuch, exactly, and Sefer HaChinuch knew that because he couldn't see it either.
Correct.
But contemplating it has an impact upon us spiritually. That to imagine what these things look like, the ark, the altar, and the other implements, to try and imagine them correctly, or as correctly as we can get, is a spiritual meditative practice. But there's an issue here. Do I imagine the ark with or without the poles? Right? Steven Spielberg, the whole face melty scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's because they took the poles out. Watch the movie again. They pull the poles out after they put it in front of the Nazi.
So they opened up the top.
Well, they did that too. And that was also stupid. But they removed the poles. And our tradition says, no, the poles stay in. The Torah says the poles stay in. So clearly they got it wrong. Because it's not the ark without the poles. It's not the ark that you should be imagining without the poles. Now we may think, but surely the giant gold box is the ark, and the poles are just poles, just for carrying it. What Sefer HaChinuch is saying here on behalf of our sages is no, it all is one piece. Just because the pieces come apart, just because the lid comes on or off, that doesn't make them separate. It's all the ark that God gave us. And if you're trying to follow this spiritual path of contemplating the look, the shape, the form, you have to have a complete image. And the complete image of the ark is poles included.
Yeah, but the poles are there specifically because in case we get chased away, in case we get attacked, we can grab it and run. Now, will there be a time in the future?
Hold on, wait, hold on. I got to correct that.
This is it.
Because what it just said is no, that's
Before
not
we have to move it quickly.
but it said that's one reason.
Yeah, I like, but that reason leads me to
Okay, because
saying,
the other
would it
reason
be
is
an-
equally important.
yes, I understood, but
Okay.
would it not be, could I not say that, okay, we've been chased throughout the ages, okay, from one country to another. Will there come a time when we can set that ark down in a place where we now know we will be able to stay, take the poles out because we won't have to leave quickly anymore?
Because of the second reason, no. Well, because of the second
Because the
reason,
second reason, 'cause it's part of
we wouldn't take them out. So you're right. If you only had the first reason, and that's
Yeah.
the way, Midrash and Talmud works. If you only had the first reason, then if we were at a time of perfect peace, maybe quickly in our own day,
okay.
then we would take the poles out. If it was just a functional emergency exit kind of thing, then we would take them out. But because of the second piece, they're saying, no, it's still important to have them there because that is part of the ark itself. And when it's all together, there is a mystical link that you can access.
I would bet money, except I'm not a betting person,
Okay?
that through studying these laws
Mhm.
and instructions very carefully,
Right?
the end result would be that every single person in this room, in contemplating what this looks like,
Mhm.
it's going to be different.
Correct.
That seems to fly in the face of this second reason. I might have this is a big might.
Okay.
I might have a spiritual positive effect from my contemplative image of this,
Mhm.
but it isn't going to be yours, and it isn't going to be his.
The image is not, but the experience will be.
Right.
Okay?
You
Want me to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah,
Oh,
just
okay.
a
Well,
bit.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to be able to wrap it up with that.
Makes sense.
Just like every other spiritual experience, it is going to be unique to each individual. But that doesn't mean the experience itself is not something that is accessible to every individual. I do not need to imagine precisely the shade of gold that your brain has picked when you imagine the altar or the ark, in order for me to also access that moment of contemplation. So my image and your image may be different, but your activity and my activity are different, are the same. It's like if both of us go walking along the river, you are probably having a very different experience and seeing different things and noticing things that I don't have, and your stride is slightly different than mine, and maybe you're a little bit fast, a little bit slower, maybe it's a little warm for you, maybe it's a little cold for you, but that doesn't mean we're both not walking by the river and that we're both not benefiting from that walk. It's unique to each of us, but it's also something that is open to each of us.
So if that's true, then why is having the poles in place so important?
So this is where we get down to the question of, that's part of the experience of imagining it, is what resonates in us when we imagine it that way, as opposed to imagining it poleless, pole lacking, without poles, sans poles. And I can't tell you what the difference is. You're going to have to experience that. Right? When you try to contemplate it, including the poles is a step, because that's how it's described in Torah. Leaving them out means you're contemplating something in a way that is deficient from the way it was described in the Torah. What we do when we mentally construct this is we recreate the act of constructing it in the first place. Right? We can't build an altar now. I mean, we can build a mock-up one if we wanted to, but we can't build a real altar because we're not allowed to. But we can mentally recreate this item. And when we do so, we should try to do it with as much detail, with as much fidelity as possible. And the fidelity of the ark in particular meant with the poles. And until you try it in both ways, it's kind of hard to explain the experience. I know that may sound a little loosey-goosey.
Yeah, okay.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
please.
Michael, go ahead,
Not to oversimplify, but
please.
We can use more simplification. It's okay.
this is metaphorically like a mantra.
Mm-hmm.
You're contemplating, you're using this as a target for your focus so that you can achieve, if you will, an altered state, a contemplative state.
No, it's perfectly fine.
And during that state of contemplation, you're in a different place than you were if you were just reading these words. And whereas it's different for everyone, the fact that you're not in this mundane world when you're thinking about this is what's the same for all. That's what I'm getting at.
And I think that's very beautiful. I just don't see that adding these.
Right. So hold on, okay, we're gonna get to a bit more about the extra details in the next paragraph, but let me give you a hypothetical to sort of tide us over. If I told you could imagine the altar in any color you liked, imagine it pink. Don't imagine it copper and bronze, imagine it pink. And do you think that would be okay?
Mm.
If someone said, I want to imagine the altar, but I don't want to imagine it with the horns. I want to imagine it with a flat top. Oh, I thought you were, but.
I think there's another reason. I'm not comfortable with Sforno's second reason.
Well, actually, Sefer HaChinuch's. Right.
Excuse me, Sefer HaChinuch's second reason. The reason I think that we need the detail is as a reference, because we may need the detail.
It doesn't, they're not mutually contradictory.
For sure. Well, for sure, according to Sefer
Yes,
HaChinuch.
exactly. I mean, I'm not saying people won't argue about that point, but I'm not saying that his point is not meant to argue with that.
So having a color, a specific color mentioned for the ark or whatever implement we're talking about is very, very important. To get a Jewish spiritual experience from it. What shade is your red? I don't think it matters. For that purpose, it has a very important other purpose.
Okay, let's move on to some other details then and see if we can't maybe tie it together. We'll see. But doesn't always come perfectly tied. Especially, I didn't do well with knots and Boy Scouts.
These are Rambam's words.
So this is still Sefer HaChinuch, but very cleverly, your instructor got to also put some Rambam in by his quote of Rambam. So
because human deeds are carried to completion by thought, speech, and action, the eternal Lord ordained that when a person sins, he is to bring an offering and rest his hands upon it, which constitutes action.
Yeah, right. See what Rambam's doing here? In order to commit a transgression, it takes thought, it takes speech, and it takes action. In order, therefore, to provide restitution, to provide atonement for that action, you're going to have to do thought, speak, and action. And the hands on the animal, that's your action.
He is to confess his sin with his mouth, which constitutes speech, and he is to burn in the fire.
Wait, just a second. Right, remember, careful, attentive reader. My hands were the action. My confession is the speech. What part is left now? Of the three. All right, he said we commit our thought. Okay, so what comes next is meant to be, in Rambam's comment, is meant to be parallel to the thought we had while we committed the transgression. It's going to be connecting to our mind. Okay, so now read what happens next and think of this as a mental exercise.
And he is to burn in the fire the entrails and the kidneys, which are the vessels of thought and desire, and the legs, which correspond to a man's hands and feet that do all his work. The blood is to be sprinkled on the altar, corresponding to his blood, which gives him life, so that a man will consider.
There's our operative word. We'll consider. Think about this, is what Rambam is saying. It's like we're doing all of these things, but the main point is not just what you've said. It's not just putting the hands on the animal. The main point is what all of this activity on this smoking, flaming altar is going to cause you to think about.
And he will consider, as he does all these acts, that he sinned toward God with his body and his spirit, and he deserves that his blood should be spilled and his body burned, if not for the kindness of the Creator, that he has taken from him the offering as exchange and ransom, that its blood should be instead of his blood, one life in lieu of another.
That's the contemplation that Rambam is advocating, that when you do tshuva, it's not just saying it, it's not just doing it, you have to internalize it and recognize that God has given you this option, has given you the opportunity to restore yourself to life. And the best way in the ancient world that people were able to get that through their thick skulls, not quite that thick, was to kill the animal right in front of them. And as they saw the animal die, as they saw the organs thrown on the fire, as they saw the smoke go up, they went, man, I was stupid.
So is the Rambam saying that he laments that he doesn't have the opportunity to do those actions so that he could get that relief?
I hesitate to speak on behalf of Rambam, but what I would suggest is the contemplation is still accessible, that they had a very graphic way of triggering those thoughts. What Rambam is saying, and Sefer HaChinuch is agreeing with by quoting him, is that we need to find a way to trigger similar repentance within ourselves, similar commitments within ourselves, without the blood and gut. And that's a little bit harder, but if we know what we're trying to do and we're not burdened by the culture of the ancient world where sacrifices was the only way you could trigger those thoughts, and we can find alternative ones, then we should still be able to achieve that state. And that's what's being described here, that the sacrifice was not about a mechanical exercise of turning an animal into ash. The sacrifice was a spiritual exercise, your own soul in the right direction. And the sacrifice was simply the vehicle that caused that internal spiritual transformation. And these are the things that should have been running through your head, not just, gee, I wish the priest would hurry up so I can get to lunch. Because, you know, the smell of this burning fat is really making me hungry. If you're thinking that, then you only did 2 out of the 3. You did the action of the hands, you did the speech of the confession, but you were elsewhere. And the same thing happens, by the way, I'll say, during services or any other Jewish ritual, right? If you're not present trying to get what you should be getting from that experience, whether it be a bar mitzvah, whether it be a wedding, whether it be a brit milah, whether it be just a regular prayer service, then yes, you've done some of what could be done, but you didn't do the actual purpose for which it was being done. You didn't quite get to the essence of it all. And that's why the altar is such an important fixture in Jewish thought and the Jewish ritual, because it was meant to trigger that thought better than anything else. Whether or not it would trigger it is something we can argue about, but the fact that we need those triggers is something I hope we can agree on. All right, keep going, because now we're running late.
The main limbs and organs of the offering correspond to the person's main limbs and organs, and the portions are eaten by the Kohanim in order to sustain the instructors of the Torah, that they should pray for him.
Right, so you feed the Kohanim so that they will, as teachers, be on your side. They will pray on your behalf, they will teach you, and hopefully they will help you avoid doing whatever it was that you did to get to this point in the past. Make sense? Good. Onward.
He went on at length about the subject.
That is to say, Rambam went on.
Writing, on the level of truth, though, there is a hidden mystic meaning. Well, we can continue by way of plain explanation and say that for this root reason, God commanded us always to bring offerings of those things for which the heart longs, such as meat and wine and bread, so that the heart should be the more aroused as one has recourse to them, and the poor man is obligated to bring a bit of his flour over which his eyes and heart are concerned the entire day.
All right, so Rambam says, yeah, at a basic level, kind of, sort of, the sacrifices were sacrifices. That is to say, you were deliberately giving up something that you wanted. And I don't know whether everybody here is a gourmet or a foodie or whatever the current terms are, but certainly in the ancient world, food was rather important because most people didn't have enough, and most people certainly didn't have enough. That was extremely rare and precious to everyone. So the idea of sacrificing something that was important to you would have an emotional trigger. But Rambam is saying that's just step one. That is like the lowest level of understanding and connection. Step two.
There is yet another way in which the heart is bestirred by an animal offering, through the similarity, since the bodies of man and animal resemble one another in all their features, being differentiated only by the fact that intelligence was given the one and not the other.
Right? So he's saying humans, animals, what's that? Crazy? Humans, animals, same thing. Except for, let's remember this is my cow, except for this whole part here, the brain. And not the brain physically, but the brain meaning rational, intelligent thought. That we have it and animals don't. And therefore,
now, since the physical man leaves the boundary of intelligence at the time of the sin, he ought to know that then he enters the boundary of the animals, and this alone sets them apart.
all right, sorry, I made a little typo there from my cut for the next part. But so basically what he's saying is, when you sin, you have erased your brain, you've erased your mind, your part that makes you human, and you are acting like an animal. Therefore, an animal on the altar is very, very appropriate. Yes, Michael.
I'm wondering, chicken and egg, do you sin because you take leave of your senses? Or when you take leave of your senses, does that, or no? Or when you sin, you become an animal? Which is he saying, or both?
Kind of both, but it's going to be more, I'd say the former, it's going to be more that as you choose to sin, it means you are turning your back on the intelligence, the rational faculty that makes you. And when you do so, you are choosing to behave bestially.
Okay. But if you always behave rationally, you would not sin.
Correct.
Because hate means mistake more than it.
Well, I mean, there's lots of different words for sin, but yeah, I mean, basically, as it's actually going to be pointed on in the next paragraph, you don't sin unless you're being stupid. And that doesn't mean that smart people don't sin. It just means that smart people are stupid sometimes too.
Since the physical man leaves the boundary of intelligence at the time of the sin, he ought to know that then he enters the boundary of the animals, as this alone sets them apart. For this reason it was commanded to take a body of flesh like himself and bring it to the site chosen for the ennobling exaltation of the intelligence. And it is to burn it, to eradicate its memory, it's burned completely. It not come to mind or be remembered, in place of his body. This, in order to form a strong conception in his heart that the entire business of a body without intelligence must perish and be completely void. Thus, let him be happy with his lot, with the intelligent spirit with which God endowed him, and that endures forever.
Okay, so why are we sacrificing animals on this beautiful altar that we made?
To remind ourselves that we acted like animals?
Right. And to remind ourselves of what gift God gave us, the gift of not having to act like an animal. Right? I mean, there were times in this country's history where they did put animals on trial. Yeah, I know. Look it up. It's
really
bizarre. Yeah. We got all sorts of weird stuff in American history. But that doesn't mean that animals are morally culpable for their behavior. Humans are. And so when you choose to not behave morally, you are choosing to join the genus of animals. And when you choose to do that, the only way to remind you of what you did, according to this, was to throw a piece of that dead animal on the fire and say, that's you at the time that you were doing what you were doing. Because you were no better than that when you did what you did. But you can be better than that, which is the promise that's being outlined here. That's the gift. It's the, and again, don't take intelligence to mean like IQ tests. We're talking about the ability to contemplate, to experience and understand the world, each other, God. That's what Rambam means by intelligence here. That's what sets you apart from the beast. It's not just problem-solving skills. It's that ultimate awareness and understanding. And that should be your goal, because that's the part of you that endures forever. And if you yield that by choosing to consistently do bad, then what difference is there between you and your dog? Right? Nothing I got against dogs. Dogs are great. Some of my best friends are dogs. Questions, comments? Still crazy?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's crazy now for at least a more compact reason. That's a nice path to Jewish spirituality. It's a little removed in that we can't do the sacrifices, so we can't have that direct contemplation. The contemplation has to be once removed.
Correct. We
okay?
don't have the physical medium to have that, yes.
But it's not the only way. And it's not, in my opinion, for me,
Mhm.
the best way. There are other ways which are, dare I say, equally authentic,
Mhm. You can dare.
okay, which resonate much more strongly with me. And I'm not ashamed to mention what it is. Words,
Mhm.
but the Hebrew letters,
Right.
from the formation, how they're created, to what they mean, to what they could mean. This is a contemplation that resonates with me.
May I say, yes, I agree with you, but that's because you're educated. You aren't just coming out of slavery. You can read, you know the letters. God is talking to people who just came out of Egypt.
But
And you notice, God was,
not.
God was expecting you, because eventually he let that temple be destroyed.
Well-
And we don't do it
Well,
that
what
way
I would
anymore.
say is gam v'gam, right? They're not arguing against each other. Your opinion doesn't actually argue against
No,
Rambam's.
no,
This
no.
this particular contemplative path to a spiritual understanding of our place and our potential within life is not against the idea of doing that through other vehicles as well.
And in fact, when I said crazy,
Mhm.
it was at some point where somebody either in the writing or in the class said, this is the best way. I don't think so.
Well, and you know, best is always going to be a wonderful superlative to argue over. But what's interesting is the description of what you gave of contemplating the language and the letters is I believe, and we can argue maybe later about this, very similar in its underpinning, which is to say contemplating through a vehicle that is uniquely human, which is our appreciation of language on a different level than any other species has of communication, is I think very resonant with Rambam. What he is saying is that the whole sacrificial system wasn't about blood and guts, it was about the human spirit and what makes us truly human. You know, at the beginning of the service for Shacharit, it's a selection taken from Yom Kippur, but it's now in every day, where it says, you know, there is no difference between us and animals. You know, what is our life? What is our righteousness? What are our good deeds? You know, really, we're nothing. And then it goes on to say, except we are the children of the covenant. Except we have the capacity to understand you, God, and to understand this world in a way that is uniquely different from the other species on this planet. And as we contemplate that through any vehicle, that's what's leading us to that shared experience of God and of the truth of Torah. And the sacrifices were an incredibly powerful, visceral medium for doing that, but they're not the exclusive medium. And for people who wrestle with, why am I reading about sacrifices over and over again? It's an important step to recognize that these were not just bloody mechanics of an ancient priest system, but that this was meant to be a contemplative spiritual activity. And that's something that often gets lost. Additionally, I have to say for many people who are less convinced of their own unique destiny compared to other animals, this is an important reminder that there are many people that, as we have elevated our understanding of animals, have devalued the distinction between humans and animals.
Good point.
And I think that this is a nice reminder that we don't get to just be like animals because it's our nature, that we are called for a higher purpose in life. And although we may not be beating the door down to sacrifice animals again, that doesn't mean we still can't learn when we read the story of the sacrifices, a very positive human lesson. All right, let's finish up because otherwise we're never going to make it. Because
However, we should not be called a member of the group of fools as we expend all our spirit in words.
basically means I'm not going to tell you everything, but I'm going to give you a little bit of stuff.
For even in much waste, a little food is found at times.
Right? You dig through the garbage, you sometimes find a nice tidbit.
Moreover, we have seen our so blessed memory say things similar to our words. For they taught about the offering of a
Sorry, that should be, we have seen our sages of blessed
Our
memory.
sages, our blessed memory, say things
Gotta learn
similar.
how to type.
For they taught about the offering of a sotah. She acted like an animal, therefore let her bring barley. The offering of a cured metzorah, he did a deed of chattering, offer up birds. Similarly, our sages of blessed memory said, by way of homily, why did the Torah say for a woman to wait 7 clean days? So that she should be very beloved by her husband,
So
her husband.
Sefer HaChinuch is collecting a few of the different teachings about different sacrifices or points of Jewish ritual to say, yes, we can come up with explanations about these as well that were not explicitly stated within Torah, and those can be useful, right? In fact, if you, the phrase, they say that it's like a homily. It's a, they're riffing on it. They're doing a little impromptu teaching about the idea based upon some of the details. But the truth is
that in their view, these are not the final ultimate purposes of those matters. It is only to inform us that the subject matter of a precept can bear many implications apart from its main and mighty principles.
Right? So he's saying, but that's not it. God didn't give us the sacrifice of the sota in order to teach us that because she behaved like an animal, she's eating barley or sacrificing barley, or because the guy who did Mitzorah, that's the leprosy type thing, not really leprosy, because we say it came from Lashon Hara, from gossip, that's why he's offering up birds. That's not the reason we have these. That's just something we can teach from it, right? The ultimate reason is something that is ineffable, that cannot be stated completely, but is only accessible through deep study, contemplation, and debate and discussion. And we should never forget and get lost in saying, oh, I heard the rabbi give a great drash about why we do such and such, and think we now know it and understand it. That's a good hook. It's a good thing to know. It helps us have a little bit more insight. Don't gossip, don't run around, etc. You should try to be beloved to your spouse, but that's not the reason why it's there. The reason is something deeper, and you got to keep pushing before you get to it. And we're going to finish off with just one little bit of wordplay, which seems entirely appropriate given our discussion. So Rabbi Chia said, the Hebrew word mizbeach can be seen as an acrostic of mechila, forgiveness, zechut, merit, bracha, blessing, and chaim, life. Right? So you just take each of the first letters of mizbeach, and each one of them, that the mizbeach was not just a place of sacrifice. That the mizbeach, the altar, was a place for all of these things. And it can be for us too, even if we don't have one, because we can always have one.
Yeah,
All right.
nice.
Now let's, drum roll please. Let's see if this actually,
3, 2, 1, go.
monitor on. Hey, looks like it worked. Where's my mouse?